Hello. Hi, good evening, and thank you very much to all of you for coming. It is a long due pleasure to have David Claerbout here with us tonight, who, as you know, will be giving a lecture on dark optics. I have to get this out of, to see better. To introduce David Claerbout is an artist working at the intersection of photography, film, and digital technology. Trained as a painter, Claerbout became more and more interested in time through investigations in the nature of photography and film. His works and immersive installations fuse together the past, present, and future into elastic timelines that engage the viewer with philosophical contemplations on our perception of time and reality, memory and experience, truth and fiction. Claerbout's work has been presented widely, including at Kunsthaus Bregenz in Bregenz, Austria, in a Netherlands Photo Museum in Rotterdam, at the SF MoMA in San Francisco, at the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, among many, many other places. And he is represented by the Sean Kelly Gallery in New York. David is also a writer, and I will read for you a short excerpt from an essay he published in May 2016 in e-flux journal, titled "The Silence of the Lens." We are no longer in a world of contingency, of possibilities created by the collaboration of lens and world, that magical environment, but have become makers of everything down to the smallest detail. We are playing God, and by God, not even God has time to think of all these elements. No, God is a shortcut here, an assumption that further betrays the ideals of which we are unaware, but according to which we nonetheless think and observe. This total fabrication implies that we are observing from memory and brings with it a sense of nostalgia and a feeling of loss, of having given up on a naive perception that supposedly happened spontaneously without thinking. Such perception is remembered as being happy because it was unconscious. Remember that consciousness is unhappy. Unconscious, unencumbered by observing one's own thinking, as Flusser reminds us in his simple but beautiful elaborations on representation and consciousness. Please welcome David Claerbout. Thank you.
Thank you. We have something like an hour, which is extremely short for my habits. And I would like to give a small introduction before I go over to, I think, 2, maximum 3 of the pieces and elaborate on them. Oh yeah, yeah. Sorry, I have a soft voice. The term dark optics was something that I thought of a few years after having written this small essay called "The Silence of the Lens," of which Amal quoted a few lines, and which, when I look back upon it now, it seems like a rather naively written text on a subject that I had just aborted on it, and since then continued thinking about it. Most of my experiences come out from work, and originally not that much from theory, although I do like to read a little bit on this and that, more or less like a fly goes from one fruit to the other. And there's something that I noticed when my studio, which is a group of about 10 young people, and myself as the cleaning personnel, when we transited from really lens-based work into work that involved much more scanning methods, and I noticed when we were using the scanning methods that there is probably a future lying ahead of us in terms of image making and image technology, which has very little to do with lens. And this is announced as we have all our devices in our pockets that are really quite good cameras, but that hardly have a lens. It's just a little piece of plastic on top of your phone. And this transition is happening, and it would seem that when we speak about dark optics, we're really speaking about just another evolution in image technology, with maybe better and more rapid, ever rapid distribution and sharing. But I kind of sense that there was something particular about the lens. And because when you use a lens as opposed to a scanning method, you're really always dependent on light. And by doing so, your lens and your camera body become really an analogy for your eyes. I made this little sketch here where just by drawing it, I realized the eye is a perfect camera. Except that the way the signals go to the brain and the back of the brain is really much more like an interpretation or a string of information. So really it's closer to a digital interpretation of that image. And so one could think there's an ongoing sequence of transitions in technology. But I think there's something more with a bigger rupture on the horizon, which is probably comparable to the epoch around the 1830s, when you had the advent of photography. And for the first time, I mean, the lens was around for a long time, but for the first time it was possible to chemically register an analogy of an outside event, and by which, in fact, the camera became really a perfect copy of mechanically of how the eye is working. And this is breaking down at the moment, and I think it's comparable to the loss of a pictorial order, which was that of painting, engraving, and all the exchange of information and image culture as it existed before the invention of photography. At the invention of photography, there's this enormous shockwave going through the Western world, essentially, that upsets anyone who's in the field of the production of images and art. Except at this time around, it's not supposed to upset us. We're not supposed to notice the transition that well. It's supposed to be far more discreet. And as the lens disappears, there is something that is returning, and that is the aspect of representation, which was always there before photography. And photography is unable to work with representation because photography, I mean the lens, can only work with a sense of analogy, a mutual authentication between someone, a device, and something that's out there. And that mutual authentication gets lost. But that, we could call it a system, a belief system, out of which we really distilled an enormous amount of confidence over the period of 160 years. It determined politics. It was evidence for about everything, and it propulsed image culture to an entirely new level. And somehow we get to a system which is much more involving representation again, essentially like we would have in the previous pictorial order, which was that of the painted or crafted or drawn or sculpted image. In other words, an image that's mediated by someone who who thinks and then acts. While hypothetically alone, the lens was able to record without a consciousness or without. It was really a liberal phenomenon in the sense that anything could appear and could be captured, literally anything. And that fact alone is something we carry with us now, which is a truth system, just like we're part of a family, and we believe in this community that's an image, a mechanically produced or electronically produced image. And we're very much at home in it, but somehow there's a sense, and I think it translates also in politics and society, there's a sense that something's falling apart. And that in words, in news, in image making, we're not entirely sure whether we can trust that system as it used to be, held as automatically, evidently there. So what's happening? What's going on? And the lens was, because of its being light-based, was a system of hope. And the dark optics are probably something that is best comparable, or at least this is the quickest metaphor I could find, of someone who's either gone blind or who will go blind, who gets the diagnosis of the doctor that with the eyes it's not going so well, and somehow has to prepare for a world in which everything needs to be questioned. Whether the authenticity of the objects around us are in fact what they seem to be. The digital materiality, which is creeping in slowly, but certainly, somehow already upsets certain sensorial certitudes that we used to have. And this is the thing that I found out in the works that I made when I made the oil workers piece 5 years back, where I worked with water, but the result was oil. Or, there's several of my works where you have the order of the materials doesn't seem to be that clear anymore. And it's as if the images become a permanent transitional situation. The second diagnosis could be that the doctor says, or you might not even be aware that you've gone mad, or that there's a sense of insanity looming on the horizon. And in The Silence of the Lens, I described it as a train ride for which the end station would be the loss of sanity in your perception. And if you think about it, I'm not sure if you feel the same, but there's a sense that when we in the studio discuss about images that are entirely photographic, we spend our time talking our way through the image like never before. We deliberate on grass, a flower, a tree, which place in the world, which season, which time of the day. All these things of which you feel that somehow an algorithm could constitute an image out of that much faster than you could take it with your phone or with a camera. And it could, if only the data of where you are, which time of the year, the day, which light, what's your point of view, essentially AI could constitute that image for you quite well. And we could say, okay, so we have this technological progress which borders always to magic, because that's what it does. This is what we need in order to be drugged enough to go with it. That's just a story of technology and human beings. I've lost my line now for a moment, but I'll get back. Or we could start questioning all those objects, and that includes the photographed world of before. And through information, get the certitude that the objects are in the place where we expect them to be. And there's this thing about the internet, which is, of course, the dominant pictorial order of today, which is this endless ocean. If you think about, if you try to spatialize the internet, it would look something probably, most people would agree that it would look like an endless ocean full of IP addresses floating around, slightly connected to one another, but with no more value than the other. It's just every IP address would be a temporal resident, or you would be a resident next to that IP address. And I realized that by now there's a generation that has known nothing else than the internet. And in the arts, but also in image making, you can feel this transition happening. It's as if everything needs to have an address. And if it doesn't have an address, it cannot possibly exist. Or it must be something that's not trustworthy. So there's this new encounter after photography, or after the lens, there's this new encounter between information and images, which is in fact quite novel, and which is something that probably people who lived 180 years ago were quite accustomed to do so. Except that now, this is what determines a big chunk of what we do in our lives, is we trust it. It's part of our family. And at the same time, we're losing it. So there's the sense, either you have blindness or you have madness. But I don't want to sound too dystopian. I don't want to, honestly, I don't know what the future of that is. But all I'm saying is that, and there I will try to end my theoretical part of the talk, is that we should be aware of that transformation. We should be probably not have the same confidence in the same ongoing way, the way we used to have it, thinking that we are in a situation of analogy with an image that's mutually there between the maker and the thing that's outside. We're in a far more discussed world in which every position has to be defended. And there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of discussion. And you can see from here that the answers are very often shortcuts. They're very often Google or Wikipedia answers for complicated questions. And when we did with the studio certain pieces like travel or oil workers, we found ourselves making these shortcuts all the time. So in a way, the question becomes this: is the image in dark optics, is it an image that is hyper-defined, or is it an image that is under-defined? Is it an image that you could compare to a lack of biodiversity in the world, where you would say, like, basically what Disney did when they made the Jungle Book, they worked with 3 or 4 different types of plants, which is a metaphor for not making too much expenses in the background and for not having to depict the biodiversity of an image? Or is it on the other hand maybe the opposite? Will we have to discuss our way through the world? Now, I'm almost 50, and I've made about 45 works in my life, some of them more complicated than others, but I have a tendency of being a passionate technophile, and I love to explore the material that I'm working in, but at the same time I also consider this technology to be my enemy. And I distinguished recently a few things of which I'm certain for the rest of my life I will be pursuing them. So I want to share them with you. One of them is the most obvious, is the use of the passage of time or duration in film. Well, yeah, sure, film is animation. It's a mechanical version of breathing. It's 24 or 25 or 30 frames per second or 70 frames per second. Regulation of rhythm and of heartbeat and of breathing. Without it, we wouldn't call it animation. It's a form of life. But in cinema and in most of what we see, there's a tendency, we're carried from one situation to the other, and I didn't want that. I wanted to be confronted with duration. And I wanted to make films that were, I didn't never plan to make films that were 1,000 years long, like the Olympia piece, which is in fact a piece of software. I never planned to make films like the Bordeaux piece that were 14 hours in length. But I just went along with real time and with the ambition to get away from the bond that exists between literature and the moving image. And in Deleuzian terms, Gilles Deleuze, there's always this competition between time image and the movement image. And I suppose I'm one of the camp of the movement image, is that I get justification from living, breathing, and being there by simply watching light unfold and pass over the background in a film, and discarding the foreground altogether. Because what is ultimately the camera doing, and what does the camera has as its subject matter? It is human beings. Because it is an analogy of our own eyes. I mean, the camera obscura is literally in the lens, the retina, the way it's turned around, the chamber of the eye is literally a form of our eye. And this was a difficult task, to use duration in a way that would be closer to breathing than to storytelling. So my preferred surface became the background and not so much the foreground. Then the second part that I knew I would always be interested in is, if we go back for a minute to this optical truth system that is collapsing. So what do you do when you get blind? What do? You try to remember, and you try to soak in as much as you can before it's too late. And I always took recourse to simple phenomena, such as wind, or the passage of time, or the movement of light, all these things that basically belong to the background, and they became my main actors, they became my principal stars. Then those phenomena, in their simplicity, I always thought they're more convincing than a specific story about a specific situation or a story, such as this or that thing that could unfold in a book or in a film. And then there's this digital materiality, which is the third aspect, which is this weird reality that we're getting into deeper and deeper, and which becomes really quite an adventurous field. It's as if one could exchange the taste of an apple with the taste of a lemon or something else. And it's as if surfaces, which is so important in digital image making, you get the right reflections, refractions, you get the right textures, but you have nothing underneath. So it's all about surfaces, which is why I love to work with water and with oil and with all these things that have in our memory something that we could actually feel even when we go blind. It's something that you could take recourse to when there's nothing else to see or when there's nothing else to trust. And I suppose this informs the melancholia that's sometimes present in my work, naturally, because I see a world eclipsing. But I'm not all that pessimistic about it, which I hope to illustrate to you with two works that I'm going to talk about now. So, if I can find it. I'm looking for the latest work I made, which is titled The Confetti Piece. I'll quickly open it up again. This one. No, but there will be now. Yeah, okay. Thank you. How long was that already? Quite a while. So the confetti piece is the last work I made, and I spent about 3.5 years working. I should keep the time. I spent about 3.5 years working, essentially scanning a lot of figurants. We scanned 80 people, and the interesting part of scanning is that you realize that when a scanner is different with a camera in that sense that a scanner is a system of avoidance. It hits a signal out there, it touches an object and it goes back. A scanner is actually a sort of metaphor for not having to touch, but knowing how far the object in front of you is. And that's really quite different with a situation of a lens which needs light and which kind of embraces everything the world has to throw at it or throws at it. So when we used scanning, it's probably because I wanted to empty out as much as possible the people that were my figurants of human photographic reality. But you wouldn't immediately notice it because it's done in a photographic manner. The confetti piece has 2 screens. It's silent. It's about 15 minutes. And it has 2 aspects to it. It's basically 2 narratives in one, which don't belong together. It's a little bit like oil and water, or water and crystal. I'm searching for these materials that contradict one another. But I'm trying not to be politically direct. Nevertheless, the subject matter or the motive in the confetti piece is a celebration of some kind, quite American, with the tricolore confetti descending extremely slowly in a hyper slow motion over the scene, and people clapping their hands, and a kind of euphoric position towards the sky. And I think I wanted to have this as a basic setup for the piece because people would look upwards towards some kind of abstract divinity and they would all be happy, smiling. And it's almost as if it's a definition of the momentary. You have confetti falling down, but never really touching the floor. And then you have these people going up with their hands and the clapping and their eyes. And it's essentially a party. But then hidden in it, as something that undermines the verticality of the work, is a young boy with his parents. And it's really, in its narrative, it's very outspoken. Because it's a family, it's a black family, it's a boy with his 2 parents, and they're the only ones in a setting which is clearly a wealthy setting, maybe somewhere in Massachusetts or whatever, in front of what looks like a neo-Gothic university campus or whatever it may be. And I was thinking, because it's a silent work, I was looking for this version of a scream, which is performed by this little kid, and which would be very loud, but at the same time completely muted. And of course I was thinking of people like Edvard Munch and the Scream, knowing very well that with painting you are in an entirely spatio-temporal setting. And here, the moment you see the little boy, you have actually been watching already minutes and minutes of a very meditative, quiet work, which seems to essentially celebrate light and these particles of confetti falling out of the sky. So it's both a painting exercise. It's both something that for me was very, very exhilarating, because I had this light in my head, and I didn't have a lot of evidence of that light, and I had to recreate everything. None of what you see exists. Everything is painted. Of course, the cloud of confetti descending is, well, this is my kitchen. I'm not sure if it's interesting to say, but it's basically a virtual or a simulated dust cloud of which we exchange the dust particles with confetti particles. And they fall very naturally. These are some stills. But as always, there's the moment when you see, if you see him, when you see that child screaming his lungs out, you are so sort of conditioned, I suppose, by the meditative aspect of this slideshow, which is ever moving forward, that you're not quite sure what comes to the foreground, if it's the scream which is mute. And this is something extraordinarily difficult, I find, is to generate noise in silence. But I'm convinced that if, other than filmmakers, if you work in a museum or in a gallery space, you should, if you can, or at least that's the exercise I try to do, you should refrain from using sound. Because sound has this really opposed temporal aspect, which collaborates very well with the moving image, of course. It would seem like they're born together, which they're not. But it would seem that way. And the problem is that if you, as I told you in the beginning, if you think about the tableau and less about the camera, then there's really no sound to be heard. It's really something that becomes quite muted. How much time do I have? We have, I'm half an hour, right? Well, it's quite okay. Maybe later, after we've gone to the other piece, I can, or before the questions, I can give you a little bit of an insight in my kitchen, which is a madhouse of technology and artist practice mixed with filmmaking, computer science, and then, of course, me thinking about what it all means. There's about 150 images in the film. And recently, several questions came or arose about why did I have to make what we see here as a simulation and not as a photographic event? Why didn't I stage everything? And I do like to work unscripted. This may seem paradoxical with the complexity and the technology in the work, but I do love to work unscripted, which is to great annoyance and irritation of my team, because they're always asking for the storyboard. But I refuse storyboards. I refuse to have the picture entirely ready in my head. and really let it come through the production. So that means that when we are recording something like this, we are spending 3.5 years while we could actually make it in half a year. But there's a lot of back and forward experimenting. People would come and I would do many sessions with each of the people, and I would not have a fixed role attributed to, or a fixed character or idea attributed to any of the figurants. I would just let things happen and see what comes out of it. And then at the end, let's say 1 month before deadline, then I would go about like a mad monteur, and I would put everything together. This is the way I work, a very long run-up to getting everything together. So here you see one of these images of the boy. We have about 45 of those, and they go in quick succession the moment we come to his screen. That's of course father and mother. This aspect of duality you will see appearing also in the next work. And in this case, of course, the duality is relatively simple. It's the only child in the scene who's shouting his way out of the scene. And then you have this festival of light and of confetti, as people seem to be unaware of what's going on around them. Okay, that's the last image is my kitchen. This is where I get my ideas. That's the picture that more than 15 years ago gave me the idea for the work. And I'm not quite sure up to this day why it became an election theme, and it certainly has nothing to do with Trump. The idea existed since more than 10 years in my head. But that's just how it goes when you think images. By the way, have you noticed that photojournalism doesn't really exist anymore? There's a lot of people doing photojournalism, but they're as if they're, I have much more the impression that then it's not that existential anymore the way it used to be. Photojournalists used to be in the line of fire, and it's as if they're coming increasingly after the facts with a great sophisticated camera, and then there's a lot of cleaning up. And that's, in my view, all part of the dark optics process happening. The next work is Olympia. Olympia is a special case, as this is not a film, but it's a computer simulation. It's a very long computer simulation. It's 1,000 years. And I had the idea while visiting this stadium, which some of you might know who have visited Berlin, and in the west side of Berlin you have this stadium, which is one of the few untouched monuments of Nazi Germany. And I went there quite regularly, not sure why. But it just stuck with me, and I suppose I was there at different times of the day. And at one point I realized that there was really an authentic beauty part of the building which troubled me because of the information that I have and that we have about Nazi Germany. And the more I studied the Olympic Stadium, the more I realized that there's truly, at some moments in the year, there's a sense which is, one cannot help but feel moved by the way the light hits the building at the end of the day. And it's so calculated that I set out reconstructing the building in virtual reality in a simulation. But I did it the way, I would say, Nazi Germany at that time and the militaristic order and its precision, I wanted to duplicate that precision. So I scanned every stone on its exact location. And I simulated the light season after season, year after year, and the vegetation, the way it would grow. It's a simulation, of course, but virtual never means non-existing. Virtual doesn't mean it's not there. Virtual just means it's somewhere in between that it being there and not being there. And I'd love to give you an idea of the way the vegetation in the work is evolving through the years. The piece is now more than 2 years old. So we'll begin here. And we started in March 2016. That's when, like a Frankenstein monster, at least for me, the work came to life. There were some difficulties, but in the end, the program is running relatively smoothly. It needs a lot of care. The most difficult part of it is to fulfill my intentions of letting the vegetation grow in real time. And which brings me to the dark optics in the sense that in order to be able to discuss the vegetation at all, I need a degree in biology, which no one would, in my situation, would be able to do. Not to mention the expertise you need in material degradation, the degradation of stone, concrete, steel, etc. Because I set out for this piece to last for 1,000 years, which is completely in opposition to a piece of software. But when you think about software, it has this open-endedness. It's almost, you can't imagine a piece of software dying. It just doesn't exist anymore, or you've replaced it with something else, or it has been updated. But falling apart, software is something that's just is not, not part of how we would think of the object of what software could be. So I figured software somewhere is a good analogy for eternity. And the eternity, or let's say the 1,000 years, that was the metaphor in Nazi Germany, which they could never have taken seriously because most of the buildings were executed so badly that, in fact, during the Nazi time, it's the theatrical aspect that took the overhand, and not the durability. And the Olympic Stadium is a good example of that. And I somehow had the intuition that vegetation would be a very good ally to fight this icon of ideology. And so I think of the work as a techno-hippie work, in the sense that it's very technological. It needs constant care as a piece of software. It needs constant updating. But it's also very utopian. I'm really hoping that vegetation will slowly eclipse the view that we have of the Olympic Stadium. And that in our simulation now predicts that over not even 12 to 15 years, we'll see nothing of the Olympic Stadium, and it will be all overgrown with trees, even small trees, but in the foreground, in front of the camera. And that brings me back to my subject matter, which is my preferred one, which is that of the background and of the witness, and not, really the opposite of an actor and the opposite of storytelling. I suppose I don't have confidence in words, nor in narrative, or nor in sequential narrative as we know it from film, or even from documentary. Now, so I'm collecting these images, which quickly change something here, which are taken, the sort of virtual photographs that are taken every 5 minutes, And so we have thousands of those since the 15th of March 2016. I'll jump a little bit to where we are now. Or is this still self-playing? Yeah. This is still in September 2016 and everything was quite clean. This is still September. I'm jumping to October of the same year. And not much has changed as we are progressing into winter. But I should add that in this work, both the placement of the sun in the sky is very precise. The vegetation is growing according to the humidity, the average humidity that you would have in a year. The information about the weather is downloaded real time from radar information and is translated directly in real time in whatever precipitation we will have. Could be snow, it could be rain, and that has its effect on the vegetation changing. So here we can already see that by November there is some changes. And this is then, was this magical moment, the first snow in January 8, 2017. And I was quite surprised to find that it really took me by surprise. I got a phone call from the place where it was exhibited, that the place was full of people because they wanted to check on me. And this was in Germany. And they wanted to check whether my weather was somehow in analogy with the weather in the Olympic Stadium. And it was kind of funny because the stadium was just a few kilometers away. But they came to check on the virtual reality. And so this work breathes day in, day out. It lives with you. And I guess it has a relation, or it has something to do with people aging. Because we live, let's say on average, 60, 70, 80 years. And this thing goes on pretentiously for another 1,000. But obviously, we are here in utopia. But it's very effective somehow because as it is an animation which is permanent, you have, I believe that the camera goes around the building once per hour or once every half an hour. Now I don't quite remember exactly how it is. It's very meditative. It's also this thing with which you could live very well day in, day out. And it's really not something that's very fit for a museum space, because that only shows, let's say, the ugly parts of the day, when it's cloudy, when it's light. And it doesn't show this magnificence that you have somehow, which the architects planned at the end of the day, where you have the last rays of sun in summertime. And, you know, basically, Nazi ideology and also this architecture comes out of Romanticism. It's a perverted form of Romanticism. And you have the situation where a group of sculptures is lit up by the last rays of light. And I'm probably the only one who ever noticed that, because I studied the passage of time so intensively in virtual reality in the place. I also don't know if it's worth mentioning, but it's definitely, I would say it's part of, it must have been intentional, that this building was also part of a religion of light, which you can see in the following image. You have, on one hand, you have this very militaristic rhetoric of these columns that repeat one after the other, day in, day out, and that look like soldiers, essentially. It also disorientates you because this doesn't really have an entrance and an exit except when you have done a complete tour, you find the exit. But despite that, it has a very precise translation of shadow and light and a relation to the sun, which is quite poetic. And I wasn't sure if I would dare to embark on this, because you can't possibly want to collaborate ideologically with Nazi Germany. No one would ever like it, and the least I would. But there's this thing which I depend very heavily upon, which is the passage of time. As if the passage of time would be perfect negotiator between your own biology and an image, between your own breathing and an image. And it's a difficulty when when you enter into the age of dark optics, is how much of your own bodily reality do you want to lose? And how much gets locked up in your head. I mean, there's a lot of material over which we could keep on talking, among others, the system of coordinates. I spoke briefly about the internet as a system of addresses, as a notion of places where people want to go there and they want to spend some time, even a few minutes in that address, and then they want to travel all across the globe, and they want to go, or the sea, and they want to spend a bit of time. And in dark optics, you have to decide how much of that information you want to shed. And the coordinate system is really quite a surprise for me to see reintroduced in the future of image making. Because what's the difference between the coordinate system? And by the coordinate system I mean essentially the Cartesian coordinates, the three axes, X, Y, and Z, which when I try to imagine what they are basically a perspective of a disembodied viewer on a space, of a viewer that has ultimate power over that space and over that coordinate system. And I somehow always, and I suppose artists in general, detest the Cartesian position of the disembodiment of mind and the world around you. And artists continuously look to bring the two back together somehow, and to get into a unified system. But the irony with the coordinate system is that this is not possible. They always have an address. And every image which is generated out of this coordinated system is an image that's imprisoned in that. And it's really the opposite of the camera. The camera is liberal. It might be, which it is, a white man's invention, and it's a tool for power, etc. It's many things. But it's also something that doesn't have a political program, simply by the fact that it's available and that it doesn't have a preconceived image. And in dark optics, you really only have choice. You have choice between this and that. You can make combinations of elements. And of course, the choice gets ever more sophisticated. So maybe this lack of biodiversity of which I'm talking, maybe it won't be for a very long time a problem. Maybe it will become instead quite a rich environment. But it is an environment full of coordinates. It's not something that you can move around freely in. But you can have the simulated awareness of moving freely in it. And one should remember that we really have to shed this environment, which is this potentiality of the camera, and learn to work with this thing that where everything is programmed, and you have variations in that system. So that, I suppose, is one of the things that brought me to do a piece like Olympia, because obviously there's, again, even in this image, there's a sense of melancholia, of course, with some truth system being lost and being replaced with a purely artificial synthetic system. But one could say it's a little bit as if you've been buried underground and you're trying to dig your way out. And you dig your way out with the simplest of tools, which are, you try to find how light looks like. And this is what I try in virtual reality. I try to find an analogy for the passage of time and the passage of light. And when we are honest, we should also probably admit that we spend most of our looking. I have this little diagram in the beginning with our eyes closed, and most of our thinking, if everything goes well, with our eyes open. And the eyes closed is, of course, just nothing else than a metaphor for this device, that one, which takes over the optical truth. And this is also this relation which I'm very fond of between, on one hand, hating the dominant sense of vision. And because this is our primary sense, we use most of the time we use vision. And there's always been throughout history this competition between looking and experiencing. And on top of that, vision is supposed to be the sensor of the senses. It's this thing that's filtering out and that's somehow preventing you to have direct experiences. One of the other diagrams that I showed, or sketches that I'd made, was something that I discovered really only recently, which is that our brains are divided in a kind of fantastic way. And up until the late Bronze Age, neurologists will correct me because what I'm doing is really very superficial talk about how the brain works. But up until the late Bronze Age, our brain, both bicameral system, didn't exist the way it evolved later. And we had a left and a right part of the brain which didn't communicate very well. And that explains voices. And according to Julian Jaynes, which wrote The Bicameral Mind, and in the breakdown of, The Origin of Consciousness, in the breakdown of the bicameral mind, which is a fantastic book on the origin of consciousness and why we are conscious people, because our brains evolved to be networked in a very sophisticated manner with one another. But still today, through evolution, they're separated in many ways. And recent neurological study and experiments have proven, beyond doubt, that when one paralyzes a part of the brain and keeps another part active, really funny things happen. And I realized that the left hemisphere is really the dominant order. This is what we culturally follow most. And the left hemisphere is the hemisphere that's used by the hunting instinct. And I know I can go far from Olympia, but it's used by the hunting instinct. And the right hemisphere is really, I would say, the devil's advocate, is the hemisphere that gives caution. So it's a way of looking for your lunch while not ending up as the lunch for someone else, which we human beings are weak creatures, of course, depend very much upon. But it's proven that in birds, now, this is still very active as the brain is split. And I realized that maybe the computer is nothing more and nothing less than the primacy of the left hemisphere. And computing can perfectly exist at one point, which is our fantasy, that it would artificial intelligence would be so self-sufficient that it could do without humans. There's a lot of talk about it, which is, in my opinion, or in my intuition, a nonsense. But it's a matter of balancing the two hemispheres. Now I'm saying this to you for the first time because I'm not quite sure what to do with it, but I know it's quite significant in dark optics. And I suppose the right hemisphere is this 360-degree vision, which is the opposite of the coordinate system. Or the coordinate system is really the wet dream of the left hemisphere. That's where language resides. But language doesn't only reside in the left hemisphere, of course. It's proven also that many of the sensorial aspects and intelligence is divided over several parts of the brain. But that's another story. So I'm kind of done. I mean, I could go on for with other work, or if someone would want me to elaborate on something or on give you a bit of insight into my kitchen. So I was wondering if maybe there are questions about anything that I've said.
Hi. Is this, you can hear me?
Yeah.
So are you using LiDAR? Is that what you're saying for scanning? Is LiDAR or?
We're basically, I mean, it's very diverse, but most of the time working with photoscan, so photometric scanning, where you use actually the camera to, and you scan an object. I mean, this is a very popular technique nowadays. Maybe it wasn't that popular when we started with it. And then feed that data to the computer, and the computer renders a 3D model out of it.
So you're photographing around, like the figure you've got there in one of your graphics, one of your images.
Exactly.
Shows a figure in your,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
But then how are you doing the stadium? And you do have, it looks like you have a diagram of a LiDAR scanner in one of your, so did you scan the stadium with LiDAR then?
No, for none of these two pieces we used that scanning technique. I mean, the stadium is made with three ways. A pole filled with cameras going around the stadium and inside of the stadium and getting all the textures. Then there's the plans of the building, which are available pretty much online or in Berlin University. And of course, we needed to have also all the aspects of where the steel is, where the concrete is, which materials are where, so that we could simulate the disintegration of the building. And that's done with a regular 3D model. Then all aspects of light, of course, continue on that same 3D model, and the simulation of the sky dome. So that's basically standard gaming practice. Well, this probably sounds like a little bit abstract to many people.
And then so it's evolving over a long period of time, right, the stadium? And is it taking into account global warming or not? Have you factored that in?
It takes it into account indirectly, in the sense that it interacts with the weather every year. A balance is made of how the year was, and the humidity and plant growth is updated accordingly. So, but that's in a delay. So, of course, these aspects do not happen in real time. So we're a little bit running after the facts. But the idea is that at one point, everything would be growing in a procedural manner. That would be my dream. And of course, it's also necessary for the work to continue existing. Because right now, it's permanent evaluation of plants. But the project, in a way, has been a success in the sense that we are discussing no longer about Nazi Germany, but we are discussing full time about plants. and vegetation. So it's that was the outset of the work, to replace political rhetoric or even architecture with weeds. There are two questions.
I was wondering if you could elaborate on your distrust, or rather your lack of confidence in words and like more traditional narrative storytelling, like you mentioned earlier.
I suppose that comes from me being a not very good speaker when I was a young man. And I guess that's what artists simply do. They count their work out of a certain system, and then they just make work that allows them to transcend that problem. And I never trusted very much what Jean Baudrillard calls beautifully 3D information, which is that information which is attached to an image, let's say to a document, which he claimed and which we're seeing today, but basically he was speaking 30 years ago, would become the most important aspect of the image, is the 3D information. Well, he said many more things. He spoke very beautifully about photography. And I always had a problem with that side information. I never really wanted to listen to it. In my archive also, I never kept data of where I found what image. And I really wanted to lose the roots of an image and its 3D information. I really wanted a rupture in there, so that the thing would, become more abstract and maybe more, and therefore more, in a way, more universal. I realize that's a naive way of approaching it. Also, I grew up with my compatriot and fellow citizen, Luc Tuymans, who, for me, became a good example of how I did not want to work, and who had this essayistic approach to any image, where 3D information would actually become the primacy and would become an essential part. I think today, let's say I started 20 years ago or 15 years ago maybe, and today I can sense that the 3D information has become all important in looking at images. We want to know where it was, who is the suffering person, and there's a lot of we want the image to be legitimized by data. And I suppose that's a natural, or maybe not a natural, but a logical evolution of the internet and of having that much information available, is that you become yourself information. And this is a thing that's often not told about when we speak about the relation between information and technology, is that we become technology. It's not that technology becomes us only. There's not only the sort of Frankenstein dream where you would have a mechanical human being that would somehow not work, be dysfunctional and then break down, and the dream would be over. I think we do what wolves did with human beings, is that we settle in data, and we settle in computing, and we settle in information, and we become it. And I think this is what you see happening quite rapidly now, although probably the process that I'm describing is something that's purely hypothetical. I mean, the madman or the aspect of insanity is not something that's coming our way necessarily. But it is what happens when you lose your confidence system, isn't it? And when your brains, when the two parts of your brain are unable to talk to one another. And computing relies very much on that aspect of the hunter, just like the camera did. But that's not exactly answering your question. I'm just brabbling.
I have a very literal question, but it's about, I guess the way that you describe the scanning process as a part of the kind of dark optics, in my sense is that it still requires like quite a bit of light, right? And then also I'm thinking about your ocean of IP addresses. I'm assuming that at least some aspect of your process will require the internet or some sort of cloud, either storage or rendering. And of course, the internet is also, it works from light because of fiber optic cables. So I'm wondering if you could, in what way does the kind of dark optics address these kinds of necessary situations where light is required, I guess?
That's a very interesting question. There seem to be at least two approaches to digital materiality. On one hand, there is this aspect that is never shown, which is, for example, I mean, you said the light and the fiber optics, but also the fact that the discrete presence of the internet is in fact deep hot hell of cooling systems that cool down servers and that are really opposite to this discretion that we would associate with cloud computing and so on. So that's one thing, but the digital materiality that I'm really interested in is that body snatcher aspect of replacing photography with photography, replacing the lens with a lens, and there's a lot of that's essentially what grabs my attention. So there's two approaches to digital materiality, which seem to be pretty much incompatible, isn't it? One is sensorial, and the other is is really the materiality of the thing.
I'm really curious about what I sense is a bit paradoxical in your work, that there seems to be an affinity, what I feel an affinity towards image making that isn't relying on a trompe-l'oeil kind of aesthetic of 3D surfaces and ray tracing, but yet, so far, I'm not familiar with your work, I'm sorry, but what I've seen is very much in the world of simulation and let's call it ray tracing, as opposed to closer to, I guess, dark optics, but before this lecture is what I would call in theater a suspension of disbelief. And I'm curious if you could speak more about the result of your work being what it is, but what I sense quite a kind of a romantic idea of image making that informs your work.
Well, I was trained not so much as a painter, but I come from traditional arts, lithographer, draftsman. I still draw a lot nowadays, and I never expected to end up in image making with lenses but I had always a profound interest in photography. I'm not sure if I would be able to answer your question or if I understand exactly what you want to ask, but I have a very hybrid approach always to the aspects of image making, and I always got the question, are you a painter or are you a filmmaker or are you, and I would say, no, I'm really a hybrid car with several different types of engines in it, all working together. And I guess that what informs the things that I do will usually be, my work will end up being is an image that is in a way very recognizable, but also very abstract. And the Olympic Stadium is, well, a typical modernist militaristic building, as you would have, in fact, many. Or I recently made a remake of the Jungle Book, the 1967 Jungle Book, which is a piece that looks like completely from another artist. But I wanted to work with this immediate collective memory, aspect of collective memory in what you see. Where, in fact, if you would close your eyes, you'd know what you had seen. And that's part of the confidence system, is that you would, I would really shy away from all the strange things that I've seen during the production of my work. I mean, my digital library is full of anomalies, which are worth books and publication, in my view, but which never see the light of day. And so usually I would avoid showing that and actually really work with something. I mean, some people say my work is cerebral, but in a way it is. It's thought images, I suppose. And via the back door, really not frontally, but via the back door, comes in aspects of bodily life, which is something that you can really only do in an indirect way, such as breathing or the passage of time, and all these things which I think in filmmaking would be, there's always this discussion in filming, how sensuous is filmmaking, how close is it to the body? And it's said that when you're in cinema, I forgot now who's this theoretician who said that. Well, anyway, that you're really taking over the body of the camera, and that you are in the body of the camera, and you're not at all disconnected. But I always felt that quite on the contrary, and maybe it's really two schools. I always felt that I felt uncomfortable in that other body, and I really would like to give back part of the sitting and being to someone being there. And I suppose that's an aspect of the loss of a fixed platform in cinema, which occurs again, I mean, this goes in waves, but which comes again with, I guess, my generation in the mid-90s or early 90s, where you have increasing access to computers and to adopting easy ways of filmmaking, and where you're not quite sure what is the space of vision. It's definitely no longer the cinema. It's also not the private viewing. When I started, I didn't realize that this would be the main platform of vision, which is the hyper-individual. And of course, I realized this is going to be explored ever further, because there are 8 hours. Well, I don't know how many hours we sleep on average, but I would say 8. Maybe in New York it's a bit less. But there are 8 hours of unexplored territory there. And this individual viewing device is just one step in reducing your sleeping hours. Jonathan Crary wrote a very nice book small book on the monopolization of sleep through vision, and of course it's a critique on capital or capitalism, which I tend not to speak about so often. Any more questions? Someone?
Obviously, there's a layered politics in just your basic theory of dark optics and the way you explore it there, but the two examples you gave are very explicitly layered with political references, and so I would just wonder how often that plays into your work, into your thinking when you're forming pieces.
Probably most of the time. But like I made a long time ago, I made a work which was very important for me, which was titled "Sections of a Happy Moment," fragments of a happy moment, and it was about the Chinese family playing in a square. The children were playing with the ball, and they were just essentially the two children were throwing the ball towards one another. And it's the moment where the ball is in mid-air and you have this happy motive, which is coming back in the confetti piece, I suppose, of everybody being directed upwards. And I realized from the beginning that there was an aspect of control, I guess, control of vision in it. Like the camera was at 500 points around the scene. So you could say this is a sort of God eyes, perverted God eye, which has access to any intimate relation that these people would have with one another as a family. But my project was to break through this sense of control with intimacy and these people being simply together without words. And if you want to call these things, if you want to read them on a political level, I suppose you can. I mean, in the Olympia stadium, it's very explicit. I mean, it's set in a way which I would usually shy away from. But the idea came to me, and not me to the idea, so I had to do it, which often happens with the stuff that I do.
So you feel that it comes to the work, it's not necessarily something that you feel compelled to link to maybe another system of politics that's operating through the
Oh no, it's
systems.
really somewhere in my right hemisphere, I guess. But it's always there. I suppose this is, I mean, in relation to your question about information and language and being verbal. I suppose it's a way of always, my work is a way of dealing with being non-verbal and being incapable of, but that doesn't mean that the verbal is excluded, not at all. And that's the same for the political. It's just that in an ocean of addresses, it's, in my opinion, really not enough of a challenge. Or it's far more of a challenge to stay away from addresses and from exact locations and exact historical events, exact nationalities, exact racial issues or gender issues, which has really become basically the project of my life, is to fight against that aspect of attributing a specific coordinate to all the objects that surround us. And I really want to fight against that.
Hi, I would just kind of like to go against what you just said, because I would argue that I think, the internet culture and, kind of postmodern neoliberalism in general, directly does that, It removes, you think about Jameson and postmodernism and consumer society, talking about how, the word is now an image, looking through the lens of like language poetry, how kind of things have been stripped of their signification and kind of reduced to kind of, just meaningless images to be consumed.
Mm-hmm.
So could you just go more in depth, like what you're trying to achieve by, kind of stripping away, the 3D, the kind of the information of the thing, like how is, I don't mean to sound like aggressive or anything, but how is that like radical? How is that doing anything of importance if it's already such a major part of how we already process information and culture and images already?
If it would be radical, and I think it wouldn't work. I prefer it to be discreet, so that it basically also really doesn't necessarily work when you view and as you read and as you dissect, but when it works in memory after the fact. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm aware that I have quite a narrow field of experimentation in terms of, but also think the parameters since post-modernity have probably changed quite a bit, and I guess that's a generational thing. We're just trying to get to terms with. I've grown up with part of the postmodern parameters, but I'm really sensing that there's this aspect now, which is essentially a generation later or more, where things are not the same. And there's something which we didn't speak about, which is this term called, it's by Mark Fisher, who coined the term pre-corporation. I don't know if you've ever heard of that term, which I thought was interesting, where he says vision at one point, when there's this status quo, and he identifies that with sort of a radical neoliberal society and economy, where there's such a necessity that all objects around you maintain their status quo, including, let's say, redistribution, inequality, that the economy doesn't allow for change. At that moment, as a consumer or as a user, you adopt a pre-corporated aspect where you, and I guess, well, I don't really want to venture because I'm not an expert at all, where Zizek would say you pay your symbolic contribution, and then you can jump back into the pre-corporated state of being. And I kind of think that dark optics are related also to pre-corporation and to the situation of, let's say, late capitalist living, where, well, no, I'm not. I think I better not develop it further. You might better want to read Mark Fisher on that. But that was not really an answer to your question, but I didn't really also. Maybe your question was too sophisticated for me. I think the first time I spoke about Olympia, there was someone who asked me a simple question. He said, "Why would you bother? Why would you bother making a project that lasts 1,000 years in real time? Why not just fast forward 1,000 years?" And there's always, I guess we always have this aspect that humans are on top of everything, regardless of whatever the technology they master or which is below them, which would justify a completely different approach, such as fast forwarding 1,000 years. That would have been the easy solution. Certainly not. I'm not sure about whether radical or not, But the tougher solution was, I think, was to have all these aspects colliding with one another, that of real time, that of ideological time, and that of getting old. All these things that do have their roots in the ground, in the soil, but are worked out entirely by data and by simulation. And people have, this is, I think, why the stuff that I do is really sort of, doesn't want to have human beings as the center of the image, which the camera does have, is that, and why I choose the side of vegetation and lengthy duration or infinite duration, is because we have a tendency to get everything that's around us to have a relation with technology, which is submissive. The technology submits itself to us. And I really don't feel it that way. I think it's both ways. And that goes to, could go up to the point where if you analyze, for example, the spectator and the image, someone would say, why do we need to have your projections and this size in a sort of semi-theatrical way? Why can't we just have it here? And in this little device, or in something that's, you know, that can migrate from one platform to the other. And I think, well, you're always canceling out the nice bit of being human in that way. You always cancel out your own position in time and space. And that's probably a fundamentalist position. But I really only pursue it to try to find sensorial residue in digital work. I guess I should stop. Thank you all for coming, unless there's still a question. Thank you.